To come to some of those other opposition parties, you look at COPE, you look at Musile Khota, you look at the DA, there was a lot of sort of bickering and fighting in Parliament over his use of the word factions, which was then construed to fractions, and the DA standing up and saying he should be allowed to use that word in Parliament.
Members of Parliament enjoy a protection within the under the law and within the rules of Parliament in terms of parliamentary privilege and the ability to speak more freely in Parliament than they can do outside. And that right has to be respected by the presiding officers in Parliament in order to ensure that we have a healthy and vibrant democracy. It's when we start to clamp down on speech in the House that we end up in these inane discussions about the rules. Rather allow robust debate. Obviously, when a line is crossed, it must be curtailed. But to rule something, a term like factions out of order in a political debate is meaningless.
And that's what the DA chief whip really honed in on, and that's where his use of the word rubbish came in, which then had John Steenhuisen, booted out of the Assembly.
Well, and quite rightly. I mean, regardless of what the issue at hand is, respect for the presiding officer is paramount in Parliament, and he apologised for that immediately afterwards when he recognised his mistake. And regardless of the conduct of or the manner in which the presiding officer is dealing with an issue, members of Parliament must respect that presiding officer. There are other mechanisms within Parliament in which to challenge the rulings of presiding officers, and those are the mechanisms that ought to be used.
So would that be a mechanism, for example, such as taking the chief whips, having a consultation privately, and then coming back?
Yeah, or raising it subsequently in a Rules Committee meeting or in another appropriate forum within Parliament, but not to display such disrespect for the chair.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I sometimes feel really sorry for the Speaker or the Chair of proceedings in Parliament, because they often seem to be kind of teachers managing over a very rowdy classroom.
But I think it's, that points to a deeper malaise within Parliament, which is the fact that as a bloc, and this is a generalization, but as a bloc, the presiding officers in Parliament seem to have lost the trust of the members of Parliament. And until that trust is restored, we're going to continue to see this bickering between, in particular, members of the opposition and the presiding officers.
And what is interesting is, I mean, the example of the rubbish quote from John Steenhuisen, there was definitely a tension and an objection from the DA. They seem to think that Tau is repeatedly, prejudicial towards them. But even with members of the ANC caucus, if Baleka Mbete is speaking, for example, and asks an MP to sit down or withdraw, there's sometimes you see cracks in the relationship because they're both members of the ANC, but they're in different roles in the Assembly.
Absolutely, and I think it's also, it reflects the fact of the lack of consistency in the rulings of the presiding officers that leads to the frustration by members of Parliament on both sides, because the presiding officers are inconsistent in their rulings. And yes, there's a perception that's been created that the presiding officers, the fact that all of them come from the ruling African National Congress, that they are, that they demonstrate a bias or preference for members of their own party and act more harshly against members of the opposition. That's a perception that the presiding officers need to dispel.